Welcome to the Michigan Works Association 2021 Annual Conference. My name is Lupe Salazar-Hamden, and I'm a career advisor for Michigan Works Southeast. On behalf of the staff at the association and all the sponsors, we thank you for being a part of the conference and the session titled Advancing Diversity and Inclusion with Evidence-Based Selection. Please be sure to visit the exhibitor booths during the designated exhibit times. Before we begin in today's session, there are a few housekeeping items that I'd like to share with you. Please make sure your audio is muted. This session will have a Q&A. Enter your questions in the chat, and the moderator or the presenters, will present your question to the presenters. We are eager for your feedback about the conference and the session. Please take a few moments to complete the short survey. The link to the survey will be posted in the chat area. And now I would like to introduce your speakers for this session. Marlene Brostrom, Program Manager with West Michigan Works. Rachel Cleveland, Technical Consultant with HireReach. Angie Barksdale, Chief Operating Officer with West Michigan Works.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lupe, for the introductions. I'm going to get us started with a little bit of history of how and why we got here today, and then I'm going to turn it over to my lovely team members and colleagues, Rachel and Marlene, to kind of get into the detail of what evidence-based selection is all about. So really, this began a journey that Mercy Health in Grand Rapids started about in 2010, so almost over 11 years ago, where they embarked really on an effort to have a better quality hire. That was the intent of their mission at the time. So they worked with a variety of consultants and experts in the field and developed what's called evidence-based selection. And after they developed this and implemented it, they found amazing results. Not only were they getting better hires, better quality hires, they were also seeing a decrease in first-year turnover and an increase in the diversity of the workforce. So fast forward a little bit to 2018. Actually, conversations probably happened around the year 2017, where we started talking about, in our region, how do you replicate this work? How do we take the learnings that Mercy Health put together, and can it be done in other industries with other companies? So we developed a partnership with Talent 2025 and West Michigan Works. We worked with funders from the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and the Doug and Maria DeVos Foundation to develop what we call HireReach. So for the last 3 years, we've been implementing this program in the West Michigan region with numerous employers. Over this time, we've innovated, we've developed, we've honed in and created what we find to be really a well-oiled machine into an academy product, which you'll hear about today. As we wrap up our last year of grant funding here in 2021, HireReach will begin transitioning to our newly founded nonprofit Strategic Workforce Solutions. And we are already in efforts to begin working with other regions to implement this work with their regional employers. In 2022, we will also begin working to launch this again in West Michigan as an employer paid model. So the funding and the grant funding that we received this last 3 years have really helped us develop our evidence-based selection work and prove out the model with numerous employers in all kinds of industries, which you'll hear about from Rachel and Marlene. So thank you for joining us today. We'll all three be available at the end to answer questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Angie. And just a little bit more introductions, if you don't mind. As Lupe said, my name is Marlene Brostrom. I'm the program manager for HireReach, and I'll share a little bit about that with you later. But just happy to be here today. I have been working for the Michigan Works System for 11 years. Serving all different roles, but all within the Business Solutions Department. So it's nice to see some familiar faces and names from some other Michigan Works. Rachel, if you don't mind maybe giving a little bit more introduction about yourself.
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rachel Cleveland. My educational background is in psychology, and I spent most of my career in the workforce space. I actually worked with Angie and Marlene at Ottawa County, Michigan Works about 10 years ago. And so excited to be back and working with them again. And since then, I've spent most of my time working with evidence-based talent systems. Looking forward to sharing more about that with you today.
Right, and I know we mentioned this earlier, but for those of you that maybe just have been joining us, if you don't mind in the chat, if you can just give us your name, title, and the organization you're with, that just gives us a sense of who's in the room. And as Lupe mentioned earlier, if you have any questions as we go throughout the day or this workshop, please feel free to use the Q&A tab on the right-hand side of your screen. And we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for some question and answer. So we're here today to talk about advancing diversity and inclusion through evidence-based selection. And in about the next 55 minutes together, we'll start at a high level, really discussing advancing diversity and inclusion in the workplace, and really 4 major buckets that we see employers can do that. And then we're going to hone in specifically on the selection and promotion part of that concept there. And then Rachel's going to spend a little bit more time talking about evidence-based selection and really getting into the science behind this framework that we use in HireReach. And then I'm going to pick back up and share with you that specific model that Angie referenced that we've been doing for 3 years with over 30 employers, and how we go about delivering that and working alongside those employers. Then as we wrap up, we want to make sure that we leave you with some strategies and resources that you can use in your day-to-day work, maybe in your own organization or with the other organizations and employers you're supporting. And then again, we've got about 10 minutes at the end left for question and answers. So I want to pause here and talk about, the importance of diversity in workforce development. So I think by now most individuals, especially if you're working alongside employers, organizations are starting to understand the importance of diversity and inclusion in their own organization, and hopefully the organizations you're working with understand that as well and have strategies in place for that. But today what we want to focus on is a specific framework and a model that we use to help support employers on this journey. So on the next slide here, and you'll see we've got some animation built in here, but we really want to focus in on, again, this diversity and inclusion, specifically from the lens of a workforce development professional. Most of you in workforce development, you're either supporting an employer directly, or maybe you're on the talent solution side and you're prepping candidates to go into organizations. But we're all working to support these organizations. And a lot of organizations, want to go and embark upon this journey. And as workforce development professionals, we want to support them. But what often lacks in workforce development are programs or specific frameworks in place to really support them on this diversity and inclusion journey. So I want to spend a few minutes just putting into context, D&I and workforce development. Again, there's many reasons why we want to support diversity and inclusion. It's the right thing to do. A number of other things, but we want to hit on 2 this morning. And the first one is, again, if we're working to support employers here and our role in workforce development, it's a strategic focus for employers. I'm not going to spend time talking about the reasons why. We hear about that quite often. At a high level, organizations really have an increased desire to recruit from a talent pool that's diverse. Also, the more diverse their employee population is, the easier it is for them to continue to recruit diverse applicants. And then again, all this research and studies out there that said organizations that have an increased, diverse workforce have a better readiness to innovate, and as a result, have a higher revenue growth. But the other thing we want to talk about today is these labor market conditions, right? So right now, I'm sure all of us have heard these employers are struggling to find talent. They have this desire to improve both, their workforce as well as increase that diversity and inclusion. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on the next slide, but some of these labor market conditions are also causing employers to really think about how can I get into broader talent pools, right? Things like a tight labor market due to the low birth rate, the low labor force participation, and these changing demographic shifts. So again, it's really important that employers that have a D&I strategy ensure they're casting as wide a net as possible to broaden their talent pool for these 2 reasons. So on this next slide, we're getting a little bit into the research, and I'll just spend a few minutes on it. But if you have not looked at this report, I'd highly encourage you to look at it. It came out spring of 2021. It's by EMSI, or MC as a lot of people call it. And it really talks about how this Sandsdemic without people is really going to transform the labor market. And again, we all knew this was happening, right? But it's a 41-page report. It's free to download right on their website, but it really studies the data, and it comes down to 3 major contributing factors that are affecting the labor market. It gives some implications as well as some strategies for employers. So it's an intriguing, fascinating report, particularly if you're in workforce development, but I just want to hit on these and then tie it back into, again, our work with employers here. The first one, again, is this mass exodus of baby boomers. I think they were mentioning this in another workshop here at the association conference. But on a normal year, these past couple of years, 2 million baby boomers have been retiring. This past year in 2020, it was 3 million. We all knew these baby boomers were going to exit the workforce. This is a huge impact on us, right? Employers were used to a labor market that had a good amount of people where they could be picky and choosy, and that's just not the case anymore. And baby boomers were a huge contributing factor. The next one is this record low labor force participation rate of prime age Americans. I know thousands of Americans voluntarily opted out of work. This report references 2.4 million women left the workforce in 2020. I know Jennifer Llewellyn in the general session earlier was saying it was about 200,000 here in the state of Michigan. The other factor with this is the male age workforce, the prime age, 25 to 54, that plunged significantly. And then interestingly, there's an increasing preference among male workers that prefer part-time over full-time. I was telling Rachel earlier, I have a brother, software developer, same case, wants to work hard, but also wants to have some time to go and enjoy the things he likes to do. And then the last thing is a low birth rate, right? If we don't have enough people replenishing those baby boomers that are exiting, again, we're tough. So what this all means and why we're sharing this data with you is that this talent market is tough. Most employers are stressed right now. And at the same time, they have this strategic and culture-driven desire to improve diversity in the workforce. And they know it's the right thing to do. So I want to transition now and talk about the specific work that employers are doing in this space. So through our work with employers, again, in the organizations that have this desire to improve diversity and inclusion for their workforce, we really see this bucketed into 4 major buckets here that organizations are working with as part of their strategy to advance D&I. The first one is sourcing, and this makes sense. You can't just magically make your workforce diverse. You have to go out and get that broader set of applicants, this qualified and diverse pool to ensure that you can then select from that pool to fill your positions. Many organizations have dedicated sourcing departments, some do not. But again, we've got to make sure that, as an organization, you're reaching out to that diverse talent pool so that you have qualified and diverse candidates to pick from. This next big bucket would be the hiring and promotion process. So again, we've got this big pool of candidates to source from. We have to make sure that there's a hiring process at the organization that's fair, objective, it's mitigating noise and bias, and factors that are typically considered in the selection process are removed so that it's fair and equitable to help ensure diversity as part of, their sourcing and talent selection process. This next bucket, which makes sense, again, we've sourced the candidates, we've brought them in with a fair and equitable process. Now you have to make sure that the organization has an inclusive culture, right? That fosters, people to feel comfortable, to feel welcome. Otherwise, that retention is going to go down. And then this last bucket is talent development. And this is really all about creating equitable opportunities for growth and development and ways to strengthen and improve this talent development and talent management process. Oftentimes we see organizations that have a D&I strategy. They might be really good at the entry level, right? And you see bigger numbers there. But as you move up positions at the organization, diversity often is not as high as it is in those lower, entry level families, I guess I would say. So again, just ensuring that talent management, talent development, that there's equitable opportunities and organizations are really looking at, the ways that people can grow and develop within the organization. So what we focus on here for HireReach is that second bucket, which is the hiring and promotion process. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So, if you work with employers, you probably notice that many are struggling with their hiring and selection process. And oftentimes you'll see the way organizations hire is different, right? From one organization to the next. Even more scary is that it often varies within an organization. One recruiter might want to do it one way or a hiring manager another way, right? So that makes it really confusing. In addition, there's a lot of good ideas and innovations about how to improve your hiring and promotion process to help with diversity and inclusion, but it's really not organized. It's overwhelmed. There's a lot of research out there. And again, this lack of framework or guidelines that makes it easy for an organization to go about. So the other thing I want to focus on here is this is not to say that hiring and promotion process is the end all be all, or if you just focus on that, it's going to improve your diversity and inclusion. It's one of these 4 strategies. So HireReach focuses on the second one, and the organizations are also working on those other big buckets as well. So I want to pause here for a moment and really think about talent selection. Now, I know many of us, again, if you're in workforce development, we do this on a day-to-day basis, right? We're helping organizations, we're posting their jobs, we're doing job fairs, or if you're on the talent side, you're working with candidates, getting them ready to go into an organization. But think about how important talent selection is for an organization. And I want to read the statement to you that we have up on the screen that says, selecting the right candidate for a job is one of the most important decisions an organization makes, right? Think about diversity in the workforce and that the way an organization decides to hire or promote a certain candidate has big implications for the employer, for the job seeker, as well as the community. So what we focus on and what we want to talk about is how do you improve and excel in such a critical activity, and how do we do it in the best way possible? So here you might think, well, why are we talking about Moneyball and Brad Pitt? But if you haven't seen the movie Moneyball, I would encourage you to watch it. It's a really good movie, but it's also fun to watch, I guess, if you like Brad Pitt. But there's a really strong parallel between Moneyball and the talent marketplace. In the movie Moneyball, Brad Pitt. He's a general manager for this baseball team, the Oakland A's. And instead of looking at, the traditional way that baseball players were recruited by scouts, he looks at it instead from more concrete numerical goals and specific player abilities. So basically what he does is he builds this team with a low budget by looking at undervalued talent using a sophisticated data gathering approach called sabermetrics. So I won't go into all the details, but the intent here and what I want to share to you is that this really revolutionized baseball. I know we're not here to talk about baseball, but there's many things we can learn about it because there is some parallels. Again, the baseball's trying to recruit players to get wins. And as an organization, you're trying to build your team, their teams with the best employees possible. And on the next slide, again, just to narrow it down a little bit more is, if we really stop and think about what organizations are trying to do in their selection process, yes, again, trying to bring good candidates in, but they're really trying to predict candidate job performance, right? The difference is that in baseball, they have game statistics, right? They can go back and look at how these players performed, how many hits they had, RBIs, things of that nature. We don't have that in talent acquisition. So it's really tough for talent acquisition teams to make these informed decisions. So if you watch the Moneyball movie, there's a scene in it where a bunch of these scouts are sitting around the table and they're trying to decide who to recruit. And one of the things that they say is, oh, it's based on how the ball sounds when, it hits the bat or how the player swings. They even go as far as to talk about one of the player's wives. And it really reminds me of the way interviews are conducted at organizations, right? Oftentimes, if there's unstructured interviews at organizations, HR, hiring managers, recruiters are making these decisions based on gut feelings that they have or how well someone interviews. But that may or may not be an indicator of how well someone's going to perform on the job. So again, these HR and talent acquisition teams are really trying to do their best to predict candidates' performance through certain selection measures. Recruitment is a big game of risk, right? You're trying to identify, is a candidate going to turn out to be an effective team player for me, or is it going to be a bad hire or a toxic employee? So again, these processes and the way organizations select talent varies from one to another. But the common things we see from most organizations, and it's not really robust, is maybe a resume screen and an interview of some sort. So what we try to do when we work with organizations is use evidence-based selection to help design a highly predictive selection process that works for the organization. I'll share details a little bit later about how we do that, but our goal is to help and work with employers to design this process that maximizes their ability to collect data to be able to predict candidate job performance. And how do we know how to do that? Thankfully, this whole concept, this big bucket of information called personnel selection has a lot of research on it. Industrial psychologists have been studying this for years. There's a wealth of meta-analysis, which Rachel's going to share some fun statistics with you later. And so we reference this body of research and some additional experts that study judgment and decision-making so we can look through this framework to help employers really maximize the way that they can hire and predict for candidate performance. And I'll turn things over to Rachel, and she's going to go a little bit deeper into the selection process and factors that can affect it.
Yeah, thank you, Marlene. So as Marlene discussed, right, employers are trying to select the right candidates. There's a lot of challenges. The talent market is tough today, but we have this desire by employers to increase the diversity and now the real need, right, to seek expanded talent pools. So we want to talk a little bit about factors that affect the selection process, and we're going to talk about some challenges, some problems, some goals of our selection processes, and then some solutions. How do we do the best job possible selecting candidates? The first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is bias and noise. And these are two big challenges for us, for talent acquisition teams, human resource teams, as they're working to objectively select talent and identify the best candidate for the job. Objectivity, fairness is a big goal of our selection processes, right? But it is challenging to bring those in. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that using the concept of predictive validity, which is a statistical concept from industrial psychology, but we'll just kind of give you guys a little intro into that so we can explore how that can be used to optimize the effectiveness of the selection process. We're also going to talk a little bit about competencies, right? These are the components of an individual we can measure to help understand how they fit with a job. And finally, we're going to look at how do we use data to make selection decisions. This is a really key piece that a lot of times, even in really strong selection processes, has some variation and bias and noise. So we'll talk about how we help employers structure their use of data to make selection decisions. Okay. So first, let's talk a little bit about these challenges, right? So bias and noise. So bias is something we're usually pretty familiar with, right? Prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that's considered unfair. And bias is an important concept to discuss. If you've ever been through an implicit bias training, you probably heard about the fact that our brains are taking in millions of data points at any point in time. And cognitive psychology, neuroscience tells us that our conscious brains can only process about 40 bits of that information at any given time, which means that, again, millions of pieces of data is being processed by our subconscious or unconscious mind. And as humans, our subconscious or unconscious works by categorizing and bucketing information into different categories, right? And so things that we've had a positive experience with before, that's familiar, that's safe, maybe gets bucketed into, you know, sort of positive things, where maybe new things that are a little scary, something we haven't encountered before, can be in a less positive space. So again, as humans, just processing data, we're inherently biased, and you know, that's okay. That's the way our brains work. So we'll talk a little bit about mitigating bias, but what we talk less about, and it is also very important, is noise. And noise is the chance variability of judgments. This is the difference in judgment and decision-making between person to person, moment to moment. You know, think about yourself as an individual professional in your role. You know, are you the same person day to day? Did you get to drink your coffee this morning? Do you have to commute into work, right? Maybe it's not too bad. You're doing this virtual conference. Do you have kids in the background, right? Did you get to sleep last night? All these things, you know, they make us a different person, different decision maker day to day. So let's talk a little bit more about noise and some of the science behind it. So noise has been the study of scientists, specifically economists, lately, and they've done a lot of work studying noise in decision-making in great depth. And there's a great book that was just published by Daniel Kahneman about noise, a flaw in human judgment. And there's a shorter paper if you, we'll talk about resources a little later, if you want to take a quick pass at this. But it's a really interesting book. And Kahneman and his co-authors explore noise, the challenges and solutions in depth. And, you know, they state wherever there's judgment, there's noise, and probably more of it than you think. Interestingly, talent selection is discussed specifically in the book and has a whole chapter. And the authors state, as a judgment task, personnel selection, right? It's like the academic word for picking talent. Personnel selection has a great advantage because it is so important. Psychologists have studied it in great detail. A great deal of research exists on the effectiveness of various selection techniques. In fact, no complex judgment task has been the focus of so much field research. Okay, so lots of information about our selecting talent. So let's look at a couple quotes from that chapter in this noise book about talent selection. So the first is, if all you know about two candidates is that one appeared better than the other in the interview, the chances that this candidate will perform better are somewhat better than flipping a coin. So unpacking this quote, we're saying if you make talent selection decisions purely on an unstructured interview, you're basically flipping a coin, right? 50-50 on whether or not you pick the right candidate, or the best candidate, I should say. Another quote from this chapter says, analysis estimates that if you and another interviewer sit in the same panel interview where you see the same two candidates interviewed or interview the same two candidates, you will still disagree about which of these two candidates is a better fit for the job about a quarter of the time. So again, noise, right? Person-to-person variation in judgment. So how can we use research to inform our selection processes? And if we have all this research about selecting talent and the right and wrong way to do it, why aren't we better at it? So we're going to kind of leave the challenges for a moment here and think about what are we trying to do in selection processes. And here we usually like to look at the definitions of fairness and objectivity, right? So fair we can define as the policy or practice of judging people on the basis of their capabilities only, without regard to race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability, right? So if we think about the selection process, we want to be identifying candidates that are the best fit with the job based on the things that are important to the job performance, right? Not other things that may color our perception of the candidate, you know, and again, lead to some of this bias and noise in decision-making. The other thing that employers are usually really trying hard to do is to be objective, right? And we can define objective as expressing or dealing with facts or conditions as perceived without distortion by personal feelings, prejudice, or interpretations. Now think about what we just learned about bias, right? This is very hard for us as individual human decision makers, right? Being truly objective in our professional roles. So what enables us to be fair and objective? We have these challenges of noise and bias. What can we do? Well, hey, there's all this research out there. So to answer this, we return to the research of industrial psychology and our noise research for some answers. So what enables us to be fair and objective? Step one is systematically gathering reliable and valid data to support our decision making. And so we need to ask ourselves, when we're selecting talent, how do we do that? How do we gather good data about candidates, right? We just heard these quotes that said, hey, the unstructured interview, probably not, the best way to do that. So what do we do? And so to answer this question, we first need to understand at a basic level, predictive validity. Recall that because we cannot see job performance, the goal of our selection process is to predict candidate job performance. And predictive validity is a statistical number that tells us how well a certain measure or tool can predict future job performance, right? So we have some data on the predictive validity of different selection tools. In other words, how good are they at predicting candidate job performance? Selection tools that are highly predictive, they aid in improving the accuracy of our decision making. And using these tools is going to help us mitigate our noise and bias, make it easier to manage and mitigate risks associated with these bad selection decisions if we're maybe not picking the right candidate for the job. By using reliable, valid, and predictive tools in our selection process, we can mitigate noise and bias, and really research teaches us the goal of our selection processes should be to maximize predictive validity. Okay, so we've been talking to you guys for a few minutes. Hopefully you're hanging in there with us, but we want to pause and have a quick discussion in the chat. We're interested in your answers to this question. So Marlene's going to enter this in chat as well, but we're wondering, what do you think the answer is when we ask you, okay, according to research, which selection tool in this list do you think is the best predictor of overall job performance? If you had to choose between unstructured interviews, where in an unstructured interview is an interview that doesn't use a standard set of questions or a rating scale. Unstructured interviews, job experience in years, general mental ability tests. These are cognitive assessments, right? Assessments of reading, math, your ability to read forms, integrity tests, or job knowledge tests. Integrity tests, I should say. This might be a personality test, or maybe a test that looks specifically at integrity. And then a job knowledge test would be something that's testing your specific knowledge of a task you're going to need to do in a job, right? So if I'm applying for a welding job, heaven forbid, because that would not be my area of expertise, you need to know how to weld, right? If I'm going to be an administrative support role, maybe I really need to know the ins and outs of Excel or have a typing test, right? It's a job knowledge test. So what do you guys think? Job knowledge test is getting some votes. We get the interview in there. So what does research tell us is the most predictive if we had to pick one from this list to use? All right, job experience getting a little bit, mostly job knowledge test, integrity test. Nice. All right, so lots of job knowledge tests. All right, awesome. Appreciate you guys jumping in here and interacting. All right, so let's take a look at what research tells us. Before I show you a big chart here, I want to remind you that industrial psychology is the study of human behavior in the workplace. I think Marlene mentioned this earlier. And they are wonderful academics who study huge data sets and spend a lot of time exhaustively studying the predictive validity of different selection tools, or how different selection tools predict how well they predict job performance. This chart shows the finding of a meta-analysis that was completed in 1998. And the results of this study are accepted as fact by the body of psychology, industrial psychologists. It's such a robust meta-analysis and study. This is the most cited study in industrial psychology. So again, really accepted as fact, and it's going to surprise you, I think. So when we look at this chart, it's showing in the first number column, the predictive validity of each of these different selection tools. Guess what's on the top? General mental ability tests, or our cognitive assessments. If we were only going to use one thing and could only pick one tool out of that list, it would be cognitive assessments. They are the most predictive of job performance. Now, with that said, we do not want you to walk away thinking we recommend employers only use cognitive assessments, because cognitive assessments also have some adverse impact. So we always recommend combining them with other things, but generally this surprises our employers and others to say, if you were going to do something alone, cognitive assessments are your most predictive. Notice the next line down is interviews, but structured is in parentheses there. Structured interviews are those that have a standard set of questions and a common rating scale. Those can also be highly predictive, but they're hard to execute. Job knowledge tests, those of you that said job knowledge tests, that's the next one on the list. Also highly predictive of job performance, followed by integrity tests. The other item you'll notice circled down here is conscientiousness tests. And that a lot of times, today you get personality assessments, right? So they'll measure both conscientiousness and integrity. So again, looking at this, at the end of the day, if you were going to build a highly predictive selection process, you'd be using cognitive assessments, job knowledge tests, probably a personality assessment, getting at conscientiousness and integrity, and then, certainly some form of structured interviews. And again, if you think about, Marlene mentioned current selection processes that employers use today, they tend to rely very heavily on job experience, years of job experience, years of education, which you see are much lower on the list in terms of predictive validity. Okay, so industrial psychology, lots of good research around which selection tools are the most predictive, the best to use in our selection processes. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about competencies, which might feel like we're jumping topics, but the idea here is to say, okay, we have all this research that says what tools we should use to assess candidates' fit with a job, but we need something to measure, right? Again, we can't see job performance. So we need to know, what should we be measuring in terms of these competencies components of folks with our selection tools. So when we work with employers, we teach them to measure two categories of competencies: occupational competencies and foundational competencies. And occupational competencies, our employers are usually measuring these. A lot of folks use job knowledge tests to measure occupational competencies, situational, behavioral-based interviewing, right? Some structured interviewing to explore their knowledge of the job. And, again, occupational competencies can be defined as the things individuals need to be able to know and do to perform a job, the tasks of a job. Welders need to know how to weld, accountants need to know accounting principles and how to use Excel sheets. And again, these competencies can be measured through job knowledge tests, structured interviews, required education, or credentials. Additionally, we encourage and teach our employers how to measure foundational competencies. And foundational competencies are the things that enable an individual to do the tasks of the job. And this is what some of these selection tools we just talked about as highly predictive are very good at measuring. Foundational competencies include things like cognitive competencies, judgment and decision-making, critical thinking, reading, math. Additionally, character or personality competencies, right? Teamwork, responsibility, right? We saw how important integrity is. And at times physical competencies, right? Depending on the job. Foundational competencies are generally measured through cognitive assessments, personality assessments that look at integrity and conscientiousness, and behaviorally based structured interviews. It's important to note that research shows that foundational competencies are highly predictive of job performance, and they tend to differentiate our high performers from our lower average performers. So the idea here is competencies are things we can measure. We can define through a job analysis process we do with employers how competencies are related to job performance for different roles. And then we know which selection tools are best, most effective, most predictive when measuring these competencies. So we put all that together into a system with employers. The one other thing to note here, many of you guys in the workforce system are probably familiar with ONET. ONET is a great resource that so many employers are not familiar with. So in our program, we do teach the employers to use the ONET. They use that competency framework to define the requirements for their roles and how they'll use the selection tools. Okay, so the last piece to kind of pull this together is what we call assessing the whole candidate. So again, stick with me here. We're trying to be accurate, fair, and objective. So we're going to use all this research of industrial psychology. We're going to use our highly predictive selection tools to measure competencies that are, demonstrated to be important to job performance. And then we need to know what to do with that data, right? We're going to get data back from these selection tools. And remember, we talked about how important it is when we're mitigating noise and bias to be structured and informed in how we're processing the data. And here we recommend what we call assessing the whole candidate. And by this, we mean gathering data on candidate competencies from different domains: cognitive, personality, past behavior, from things like structured interview, and specific job knowledge. And we teach employers to use a structured, informed way of combining and processing the results of these different selection tools to give us a complete picture of the candidate as an individual and how they fit with the job requirements. And we'll talk more about how we do this specifically for employers coming up here. So what does this mean? In a typical process, employers might use assessments, but how they interpret the scores may vary. In another scenario, employers may make decisions based on one selection tool, one interview, where here we're really encouraging, let's select based on strengths, not weaknesses, and look at the whole person. And This also helps employers with this idea of sort of screening in or finding candidates that are capable to do the job that may not have the perfect qualifications. And that gets back to this labor market challenge and helping employers maybe get rid of some unnecessary minimum requirements and really look at the foundational competencies to say, hey, who's really set up to do this job if I maybe gave them a little, on-the-job training. Okay. So that was a lot of data, but we want to pull back to this noise research, and there's a very clear solution that the book and the shorter article from Kahneman and the folks doing the noise research put forward. This is kind of a mouthful of a statement, but let's unpack this a little bit. So what they say is, okay, if you want to mitigate noise and bias in professional decision-making, the key is to adopt procedures that promote consistency by ensuring that employees in the same role use similar methods to seek information and integrate it into the view of the case and translate that view into a decision. So promote consistency using similar methods, standard process, right? Using these highly predictive selection tools to seek information, and then the integrating it into the view and that view into a decision, right? That's how we process the data. That's what we're talking about with this assessing the whole candidate. So now I'm gonna go down sort of a level of granularity here and talk a little bit about the work that we do with employers. And Marlene will talk about this more in a moment when we talk about the HireReach program. But again, at the end of the day, we're trying to be fair and objective in our selection processes so we can pick the best candidate, right? And bringing diversity in, not letting noise and bias negatively impact our selection processes. To do that, we're using our highly predictive selection tools to measure competencies, and we're processing the data from those selection tools in an informed and consistent fashion. So the work that we do with employers to help them implement these very important concepts fall into these 4 buckets. The first is jobs, right? We need to understand what competencies should be measured in the selection process to predict job performance. If we're measuring the wrong thing, we're not going to be good at predicting job performance, right? Even if we're measuring competencies. If I'm, maybe I'm hiring for a software developer job, and you know what, I'm going to get to work all day in my dark basement room, and I really only have to talk to my project manager every once in a while. Maybe teamwork just isn't that important for me. Whereas, those of you that are working in the workforce system, either on the talent side or the business solution side, right, you're working with people all day, right? Teamwork is really key. So we need to understand which competencies are important to measure for which job, and that's what the jobs piece is about. Tools is going back to those selection tools, right? How do we measure these competencies using valid, reliable, and highly predictive selection tools? And we partner with our employers to work on that. I don't want anybody to come away today saying, oh, assessments are the magical solution and all assessments are wonderful. Unfortunately, that's not true, right? So we need to think about the predictive validities, how effective our different tools are, and we work with our employers to implement, again, highly valid, reliable, and predictive tools to measure the competencies. The data piece, right? Data from multiple sources are measured using what we call a compensatory scoring system. I'll show you that in just a moment, to evaluate the whole person, right? Assessing the whole candidate, as we just looked at, bringing multiple data points together to give us one overall score of the job fit. And then finally, looking at outcomes, right? This is really about continuous improvement. What are you trying to do with your selection process? How is it performing? And if things aren't going well, right? How do we, in a systematic way, improve the selection process? All right, so this is what we're doing with our work with employers. The one other piece I want to show you before we hand things over to Marlene here is this idea of assessing the whole candidate. Our subject matter experts, scientists that we've worked with over the last 10 years, really, as Angie said, this has been a journey for quite some time, have helped us come up with something we call compensatory scoring. And we feel like this is a real differentiator for employers because this enables recruiting teams to do that, assessing the whole person thing by combining data, measuring candidate competencies in different domains. And this both, we think, has really helped quality of hire because, again, you're looking at that whole person, but also very much diversity, right? We're bringing some systematic processing of data into the use of these selection tools before any intuitive decision-making occurs, and it really helps mitigate that bias. All right, Marlene, I'm going to hand it back to you.
All right, thank you, Rachel. So, we heard from Rachel, we reviewed the challenges, talked about some of the best practices and solutions. And right now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about the work that we did with the organizations. A lot of employers that we work with, and probably those that you work with, know that there's opportunities and ways they could and should improve their talent selection process, but they don't have the time, knowledge, or resources, especially now with such a tight labor market where they're getting immense pressure from leadership to, fill the positions. And again, like we talked about earlier, it is a tight labor market. It's really tough. So the HireReach Academy really helps organizations, again, redesign their selection process, taking into account all those things that Rachel talked about earlier, again, with the effort to maximize predictive ability and again, mitigate these risks of a bad hire and ultimately hire a good candidate for their organization. So what we do is we help organizations, again, improve it through this evidence-based selection model that Rachel talked about. The intent here is that organizations are getting better, more, and accurate data, which helps them get better decisions, which ultimately impacts some of those, bottom line numbers that they're really interested about. So again, we incorporate those fair and objective process, mitigating noise and bias, using those predictive tools. And again, this allows the organization to get more information and the metrics that employers are really interested in. Again, most employers say, this is the right thing to do. We know we should improve this, but it also means a lot to them if they can say, hey, we're able to reduce our time to fill. We can get better hires, better quality of hire, more diversity, and less turnover. And so this slide here is similar to what Rachel just went over, but I just want to share with you a little bit more about the details and the specifics of what we do with employers, right? What does it mean when we say they do evidence-based selection with us, right? So starting up on the top left-hand side of the screen is this jobs. If we're using evidence-based selection, organizations first have to understand the evidence they need to collect, like Rachel talked about. So organizations go through an activity called job grouping, which buckets their jobs into families, allows for us to get some additional statistics out of it, and makes it more manageable for talent acquisition teams to manage. Organizations are then able to identify those competencies and understand what makes a good hire. And then in the next bucket, again, once we know what evidence we need to collect, it's a matter of using those predictive selection tools. And again, Rachel referenced that industrial and organizational psychology, again, really reiterating the importance, if you're able to, using those cognitive assessments, personality assessments, career interest, as well as structured interviews. And again, organizations can gather this data using reliable and valid measures. I will say this is a tough space for our employers as the market is flooded right now with various vendors and assessments. And there's a difference between assessments that are maybe used for, communication, teamwork, building, development purposes versus selection. So we help organizations really understand the science of industrial and organizational psychology to figure out that space. The next bucket, as Rachel was mentioning just on her last slide, was, again, now we got this data. How does an organization, how do talent acquisition teams interpret this data? And we use that compensatory scoring system that Rachel talked about. And then we help the organization set up a system where they can use the data that they collected during an interview and then performance metrics. So again, they can start validating that data and really seeing what works, what's not working, and do these things that they're measuring, correlate to a high performer. And that's really this last bucket of outcomes. Within all this, and again, using some of the science, the research, the tools, we also work with organizations on being able to set up and run a structured, consistent process, which leads to some of the efficiency and the reduction in the time to fill, but also helps them, again, achieve those metrics of the lower turnover, the better diversity, and improved job performance. And again, using that data to continuously improve, just like the manufacturing sector does. So how does this get delivered to organizations, right? As you can tell, that's a lot of information. It's a lot of science, and it's not an easy journey for many organizations to embark upon. And that's where the HireReach Academy really comes in. And as Angie mentioned earlier, we were grateful. We had some funding and some support initially early on from some funders. And we've now got a really good model for working with organizations and really allows us and the employers to operationalize the science of industrial organizational psychology and combine all those elements that Rachel talked about. Another thing I want to mention is one of the other things that I feel makes this program really special is, again, establishing and leveraging the research that Rachel talked about earlier, but also we had a strong guidance, and I guess you call it bench strength here from the HireReach side. We enlisted in the help of industrial psychologists, psychometricians. We had a legal defensibility expert that actually was the author of the EEOC's Uniform Guidelines on Selection, a job analyst, change management expert, and a talent acquisition consultant as well. So as a result of this program, the research Rachel talked about, and these subject matter experts, we've been able to create a program that's been a 5-month virtual academy for organizations that really walks organizations through some hands-on learning and activities so that they can understand and learn these elements. We really believe in, teach them how to fish, not just give them, a tool or a product, but really help them understand and make sense of this research. Some facilitated peer learning, right? The organizations come together, they expand perspectives, they make these connections, they learn from one another. We give them access to selection tools. Within our program, we've got a partner vendor that can provide, access to those tools so that they can make informed decisions and predict job performance. And then we give them some customized consulting and support to help them, make a process that works for them. It's not a one size fits all. What we try to do is say, let's incorporate these key elements, these core concepts, and customize in a way that makes sense to the organization while still staying true to those core elements. And the next slide I want to share with you is, again, I always smile when I see this slide. What's really exciting is that we've been doing this program, as Angie mentioned, for 3 years. We've worked with over 30 organizations, different industries and various sizes. We work with a small local company that's got 30, 40 employees, up to a global company that has literally rolled out this process across their entire operations. So we've had the opportunity to partner with some amazing organizations and their subject matter experts, and we feel we do have this vetted, strong, established model for supporting employers. And all these organizations here that we've worked with, and again, some of them are further on the journey. Some of them started this in 2019, so they have a lot of data built up, and some of them have just started it in the spring of this year. But they've all reported that they've seen reduction in the time to fill, the reduction in the turnover, and an increase in diversity. And another thing on which we're hearing, which is really exciting in today's tight labor market, is improved efficiency for their talent acquisition teams, right? It sounds like maybe it's a lot more into their process, but again, the organizations are reporting it actually reduced their time to fill. They get the data early on, they can make that decision and move forward with who they want to move forward with, and then increased efficiencies for their team. They're running a standard process. Everyone knows what to do. They can step in for each other, and it doesn't just vary based on hiring manager or recruiter. So Rachel and I at this point have been talking quite a bit. We do want to share with you a video with some of our employers sharing their perspective and the impact it's had on their organization. And it's really exciting for us that not only has it impacted the organization, it's impacted the job seekers or their employees, as well as our West Michigan region as well. So Rachel, if you don't mind, if we can start that video.
Sometimes we don't make the best decisions on who we hire because we're just so eager to get someone in to do the job.
You know, I was in labor relations for a while at the city, and I think sometimes you end up with problems in the workforce and people are just cast in the wrong role.
We're competing for jobs for candidates with the same people, and we're always looking for a leg up and some way to better our process.
Talent attraction, development, and retention are universal challenges.
A decentralized hiring process was not going to allow us to reach the heights and reach the goals that we wanted for ourselves.
Most organizations have the desire to do the right thing. HireReach helps organizations make better hiring decisions with data and evidence to support talent acquisition as they make those decisions, really with the goal to make it fair, reduce bias, reduce noise, and then ultimately impacting the quality of hire, reducing turnover, and increasing diversity of their workforce.
HireReach brings that research, that knowledge about the right way to hire and promote individuals, to give employers everything they need to implement evidence-based selection and a scientific, data-driven, fair selection process.
We had a lot of tools and a lot of time with them. They took the time to learn what we needed to do at the City of Grand Rapids, and they learned about our hiring process.
It's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all application. And so, you know, you can certainly work with their team to figure out a solution that works best for you.
Organizations are different industries, different employee size, different products, different service offerings. And the benefit of HireReach is there's support there so that they can implement evidence-based selection in a way that really works for their organization.
Evidence-based selection brings to us different benefits. It impacts our ability to create equal access to opportunity.
Change for an entire organization, systemic change, transformational change. Those aren't always easy conversations to have.
One of our goals is, in being a triple bottom line organization, is trying to reflect our community. And if this process allows a vast variety of diverse candidates to be employed at Cascade Engineering, that's a win for us as a company.
We have seen more candidates of color in our pools of people who are eligible to move forward in the process than what we had seen before, which is very impactful for our organization.
I rely on data, on science to make decisions. Now I am equipped to mitigate bias in our process.
It's every step in the process that's helping us measure.
I didn't realize the impact of those tools and how they could affect not only the candidates that we are considering bringing in, but how those candidates can progress within their career with us.
HireReach has made my job better as a leader within an organization. I have much greater confidence that the results will meet our goals of greater quality and greater diversity.
And this is a process that helps companies recruit, and not only recruit, but retain individuals with great talent. One of the key benefits of this was really giving us an opportunity to take a deep dive.
Talent acquisition, we are the face of the organization many times. We are the individuals that are helping to bring in individuals that will serve our communities. And this process has really helped position us strategically to do that.
All right, Rachel, if you can advance to the next slide. So as you can see, it's made an impact for the organizations. And again, our goal isn't to come in and tell them how they should be doing something, but really to support them and, helping them, give them a framework to do the things they want to do to improve their talent selection process. So again, we've given you a lot of information this morning. We're wrapping up here. I know we've got a few minutes left, but what we want to leave you with is some things to consider and some steps you can do in your work with employers. That's, to me, I love going to these workshops and conferences. And if I hear a great idea, but if I'm not left with some next steps that I can do, it's usually a little bit frustrating. So we want to make sure we could give you some things and strategies you could begin working on, again, to support these employers. So the first thing is really to start having these conversations with employers, right? Encourage them, or if you are an employer yourself, right? Start thinking about some of these things and ponder where your selection process is currently at and where there's those opportunities to improve to help decide where to focus your effort. We have a list of questions here that we'll pull up on the screen. And usually when we meet with organizations who have expressed their initial interest in HireReach, we ask them to consider some of these following questions as it relates to their selection process. So the first one is, does the organization understand what makes a good hire? Again, going back to this Moneyball, are these things the gut feeling or things that they think sound good? But again, really narrowing it down to identifying what makes a good hire. Is the organization assessing those foundational competencies like Rachel talked about? Again, organizations are usually pretty good on the occupational side. The foundational side is really important. Again, establishes and really separates those high performers from the low performers. The next one, are recruiters and hiring managers using a consistent and structured process? I would say most of the organizations we work with, there's big variety, right? Between recruiter to recruiter, hiring manager to hiring manager, how they want to do it. Does the selection process include, again, these highly predictive selection tools? Are they using the right tools? Are they using tools that maybe are more something meant for talent development, not selection? And then this last one, like Rachel said, it's almost like the secret sauce is, are recruiters and hiring managers looking at a candidate holistically versus just making an assumption or a judgment on one set of data? The next thing we want to talk with you about is, what are some of the other things that you can do, again, to support these employers? So these are some practical steps. Again, some of these are really easy to get started with. One is encouraging those employers to use those high quality assessments to measure candidate competencies. Rachel shared with you some of the interesting findings from industrial and organizational psychology. Just a question to start thinking about, right? What assessments are you using? It's really easy to get caught up in some of the nice marketing language from some of these vendors here, but really looking at valid and reliable assessments. The next one is job requirements, right? Assisting employers and helping them review job descriptions and unnecessary education and experience requirements. Organizations are busy right now. Talent acquisition teams are busy. They're using job descriptions that were 10 years ago. There were studies out there. I'm not going to give specific percentages because I don't have the study right in front of me, but sometimes requiring a 4-year degree eliminates up to 60 to 70% of a certain diverse population. So again, if the job requires it, that's completely fine, but really start to think as an organization, what are the requirements? Are they nice to haves or are they must haves? Because it does have an implication on the candidate pool. The next one is exploring Own It. Like Rachel said, great resource. We all know it. To us, it's probably something we use day to day. Organizations are not aware of it. Every time we introduce it to the employers, they love it. They're able to rewrite their job descriptions and really look at these competencies. And then interviews. Support employers in moving maybe from these unstructured interviews to structured interviews. And I'll share a resource with you in a little bit. And then again, just sharing some ongoing valid research with these organizations, always making sure you're giving them the latest and updated information to support them in this journey. And then the next slide, we do want to leave you with some resources. We reference this author multiple times. His name is Daniel Kahneman. And again, he spent his whole life studying economics. He understands judgment and decision making. If you want just the intro into it, I'd suggest the Harvard Business Review article. I think it's like a 7-page article. If you want a deeper dive, he has a thick book. When I got it from Amazon, I did not realize it is this big. But it's a great deep dive again about judgment and decision making, talk specifically in the legal scenario as well as talent acquisition. So those would be good books to get you started. And then on the next one, we do have 2 guidebooks that we've created here for HireReach. One is an evidence-based selection guidebook, which is really like our guidebook to support employers in the academy, teaching them about evidence-based selection, and then a companion book, which is our talent acquisition book. So think of it as the evidence-based selection books teaches them how to design a process to maximize predictability, and the talent acquisition book really teaches them how to operationalize it. Gives them some forms and templates, forms they can use when they're working with the hiring manager to turn over a candidate, or interview guides. And if you want, these are available on Amazon, but if you want a copy of our evidence-based selection book, you can email us, and I'll put our screen up on the next slide, and we'd be more than happy to email you a copy of the book or send you a copy. I'm trying to talk fast because I know we got a few minutes left, so I just want to leave you with our website. If you have any questions or want additional information on our website, we have a flyer overview, we've got some content on there. And again, if you are interested in getting a copy of our guidebook, let us know. With that being said, Lupe, I only left us with 3 minutes left. So at this point, we have time for questions. I don't think I see any in there, Lupe, so I think we're fine. Everyone's got our email address.
We had one question. And so I just want to scroll up. So it was, does HireReach take into account candidates that need reasonable accommodations? Yeah, absolutely. So that gets into this piece of not all selection tools are created equal. So the really high quality assessment tools that are designed for selection, the organizations that the industrial psychologists that have those, they will have accommodations departments. The accommodation guidelines, unless it's something that's federally or state mandated, are an employer by employer decision, but we encourage employers as they're implementing the structured selection process to define their reasonable accommodations policies, and to have a series of accommodations that they have planned for individuals as they go through the workforce. Now, I will say it is much simpler to provide accommodations for things, blindness, deafness, that are sort of established, in the laws, touch those. There are new things that employers are struggling with, right? What do we do with some folks, maybe if they have autism or something like that, right? So not to say all the answers are there, but this is a structured practice, and our high quality vendors, as well as our team, will support employers in ensuring that there are accommodations as needed. All right, thanks, Marlene. I'll hand it back to you.
That's okay. And Lupe, I think I'll turn it back to you with 2 minutes to spare. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're fine. So with no other questions, just a reminder that presentations will be available post-conference on the Michigan Works Association website. This ends our presentation today, and I would like to thank our presenters. We appreciate everyone's time, and I hope you've had some great takeaways and will enjoy all the features of the conference. Exhibitors, a networking break is next. Take time after the session to video chat with an exhibitor or watch their informational video. Or go to the networking tab and be randomly paired with another attendee for 2 minutes to meet new people. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.